They thought they were untouchable. They thought their stucco palaces and petty rules could lock me out of the lake my family had used for 3 generations. They thought wrong. Because when the HOA president, a woman whose soul was as dry as the drought-ridden sod she policed, voted to seize the only public access point to Lake Serenity, she signed her own financial death warrant. You're about to witness how I didn't just get my boat ramp back. I watched their $1 million zero-lot line nightmares become legally unsaleable. I handed them a financial nuclear disaster, and the best part? It was all perfectly legal. This kind of high-stakes, vindictive justice takes preparation, a lawyer with a black belt in property law, and a willingness to watch the world burn. If that sounds like your kind of drama, smash that like button until your thumb hurts. Subscribe for more HOA horror stories that keep me up at night. And let's dive into the lake of tears these entitled tyrants cried when they realized they messed with the wrong homeowner. The reckoning starts now. The tranquility of Lake Serenity had always been the one constant in my life, a deep, cool blue anchor against the chaos of the city. I inherited my grandfather's small, modest cabin, a relic of the area's past, perched on the edge of the lake, right next to the strip of shoreline the Lakeview Estates HOA was built around. For decades, the boat ramp right by my property line was a shared de facto public access point. My cabin was small, but the lake access was priceless. Enter Priscilla Thorne, a woman who confused affluence with aptitude and was recently elected president of the Lakeview Estates HOA. Her home was a sterile, 3-story monument to bad taste and over-leveraged mortgages, and from her perch, she decided my boat, my modest lifestyle, and my grandfather's memory were an eyesore and a threat to her property values. The conflict started with the most petty microaggressive nonsense you could imagine. First, it was a finely printed passive-aggressive notice about my trailer being parked 3 inches onto the shared easement. Then, a friendly suggestion that my boat was unnecessarily loud at dawn. I ignored the noise. I knew she was testing the waters. The real move came 2 months in. I received a certified letter, signed, of course, by the imperious Priscilla, stating that the Lake Serenity access point was now permanently closed for extensive, indefinite maintenance and would be converted into a private, residents-only amenity for the Lakeview Estates HOA. They didn't own the land outright, not exactly. The original plat for the entire area designated that strip as a common area for access and recreation for all surrounding property owners, a crucial distinction that had been deliberately misinterpreted and steamrolled by Priscilla's board. This wasn't just a petty spat. This was them trying to legally steal my fundamental right to the water, destroying the very thing that gave my cabin its value. I tried the polite route, of course. I attended their next open meeting, clipboard in hand, citing the original deeds and the county zoning code. Priscilla listened, her face a mask of condescending boredom, and then smiled thinly. "Mr. Protagonist name," she purred, "your grandfather's deed predates the current covenants. While we sympathize with your nostalgia, the $20,000 we just spent on exclusive landscaping, and security gates to protect our residents, safety overrides your quaint little historical claim. They had physically erected a steel mesh gate with a combination lock, effectively sealing the lake from me and anyone outside their gilded cage. I stood there realizing I was dealing with a level of entitlement and legal chicanery that required more than a polite objection. I had to fight fire with napalm. The fight for Lake Serenity access exploded almost immediately after that meeting. Priscilla saw my silence as surrender and doubled down on her reign of terror. She didn't just keep the gate locked. She installed blinding LED floodlights pointing directly at my cabin, claiming it was security. She hired a private security guard, a guy who looked like a Rent-A-Cop parody, to patrol the small stretch of beach outside the new gate, making sure I couldn't even launch a kayak from the reeds. She was actively trying to force me out. But the real bomb dropped when I tried to refinance my cabin. The bank's appraisal came back 65% lower than expected. The reason? Severely diminished utility due to loss of primary recreational access. Priscilla hadn't just inconvenienced me. She had stolen the equity my grandfather had worked his whole life to build. That's when it stopped being a property dispute and became a war for my financial survival. I hired an attorney, not a cheap one, but a pit bull specializing in environmental and land use law, and he confirmed my worst fears and my one sliver of hope. The original plat did reserve that access point for common and public use, but the HOA's bylaws, specifically written by a previous developer, contained a sneaky clause allowing a majority vote of the board to reclassify amenity usage for the security and betterment of its members. It was an egregious loophole, deliberately designed to screw over small landowners like me. The lawyer, a wiry, sharp-eyed man named Mr. Chen, laid out the harsh truth. A simple lawsuit to get the gate taken down would take years, cost a fortune, and the HOA had deep pockets fueled by massive dues. "You can fight the gate or you can burn down the whole village," he said. I chose the latter. The frustration of being unable to launch my boat, of watching Priscilla and her cronies smugly sunbathe on my access point, was a daily grinding torture. I started documenting everything: video of the illegal floodlights bathing my bedroom, photos of the rent-a-cop harassing guests, and, most importantly, I pulled every single public record for the Lakeview Estates development, including the original Environmental Impact Study, EIS. That study, mandated because of the project's proximity to a protected watershed, contained the nuclear option. The entire development, sitting atop a steep slope leading directly to the lake, had been approved under a strict, non-negotiable condition: a Category 4 vegetative buffer and a mandatory erosion control system were required along the entire lake-facing perimeter to prevent silt and runoff from poisoning the lake. The condition was tied directly to the certificates of occupancy for every single home. Now, here's the kicker, the detail that had been overlooked for years. The HOA's bylaws, the same ones Priscilla was using to block me, explicitly gave the board the power to re-landscape and rezone common areas without a full membership vote. And what had Priscilla done to build her exclusive landscaping and security gate? She'd ordered the removal of the specific, deep-rooted native grasses that formed a key component of the mandated Category 4 vegetative buffer, and the construction of the gate's foundation had breached the underground silt fencing of the erosion control system. I was helpless for a moment, locked out, losing money, and stewing in pure distilled rage, but I was holding the smoking gun that didn't just target her gate. It targeted the legal viability of every home in Lakeview Estates. The climax wasn't a shouting match. It was the quiet, terrifying thud of a cease and desist order being served. Mr. Chen had prepared a multi-pronged attack. The initial volley was a simple filing with the County Planning Department and the State Environmental Quality Board, EQB, not against the HOA for blocking my access, but against the HOA board, specifically naming Priscilla Thorne, for willful and documented breach of the 1998 Environmental Impact Study conditions. The evidence was irrefutable. High-resolution drone footage I'd commissioned showing the eroded, bare earth where the native grasses should have been, side by side with the original EIS map showing the required buffer zone. I included Priscilla's own certified letter detailing the extensive landscaping, which provided the perfect paper trail of her culpability. The EQB didn't mess around. The lake was part of a protected watershed, and violating the EIS conditions was a Class 3 environmental felony carrying massive daily fines and, crucially, the power to revoke or suspend certificates of compliance. The day the inspectors arrived, Priscilla was out, attending a yacht club luncheon, oblivious. They spent 5 hours surveying the perimeter, their clipboards ticking off violation after violation, especially around the new illegally built gate. The resolution wasn't just the gate coming down. The EQB's final order was lethal. Due to the severe and unmitigated breach of erosion controls, the mandatory fix was the construction of a 300-foot-long, 8-foot-high reinforced retaining wall along the entire slope to prevent an actual landslide into the lake. The kicker? Until the wall was completed to their exacting standards and recertified, every single home in Lakeview Estates was issued a stop work, stop sale order. This meant no permits for renovations, and no home could be legally sold or refinanced. Climax achieved? My victory was complete when I received a personal call from Mr. Chen, who was barely containing his laughter. They're trying to figure out how to pay for a $3 million wall while all their homes are instantly worthless on the market. Also, the gate is now legally mandated to be open 24/7 for emergency access by the county. I drove my boat through the now useless gate that evening, the new security guard watching in impotent silence. The fallout was a spectacular implosion worthy of a Hollywood disaster movie. Within 72 hours of the EQB order, an emergency HOA meeting was called. I didn't have to be there. The sound of their mutual financial panic echoed across the lake. Priscilla, the architect of this cataclysm, tried to spin it as a clerical error, but the homeowners were looking at a six-figure special assessment each and the immediate death of their property value. One homeowner, who had a closing scheduled for the next week, now had a house they couldn't sell, and a furious buyer demanding their $50,000 earnest money back. The anger was volcanic. The first consequence, Priscilla Thorne was unanimously recalled and then, in a deliciously vindictive move, personally fined by the new, terrified emergency board for the initial legal fees I incurred, based on a rarely used clause about board member negligence. Her shame was public and total. Local news picked up the story, detailing how entitled HOA boss destroys $50 million in property value over a petty grudge. I ensured the journalist had access to all the public records, focusing on the hypocrisy of her using the security of the lake as a pretext to build her private gate, while simultaneously poisoning the watershed. She resigned, of course, moving out less than a month later, her sterile palace selling at a 15% discount to a cash buyer who didn't need a mortgage and clearly didn't care about the toxic situation. But my payback wasn't complete with her resignation. The new emergency board, desperate to show good faith and avoid more litigation from me, offered a settlement. They would pay for all my legal fees, and they would establish a permanent, legally binding easement ensuring my family's right to the boat ramp in perpetuity. I accepted the terms but added one final, glorious condition to the settlement. The emergency board had to issue a formal, written apology to be posted on the community board and emailed to every single Lakeview Estates resident, acknowledging that the original gate was erected out of malice and in direct violation of community and environmental standards. They signed it. I framed it. The final nail in the coffin of Priscilla's little kingdom was one last act of poetic, permanent justice. The retaining wall, the mandated $3 million behemoth, finally went up. It was a brutalist, gunite gray monstrosity that stretched the length of the entire development's lakefront, an 8-foot-tall monument to their avarice and my victory. It wasn't just ugly. It effectively blocked the unobstructed lake views that were the primary selling point for the first-floor units, making them permanently less desirable. The views from Priscilla's old house were now partially dominated by a solid wall of concrete. That was the aesthetic revenge. The financial finality came courtesy of the new HOA board, now utterly cowed and focused entirely on their remaining property values. To avoid the massive special assessment and any future liability from environmentalists, they voted to permanently deed the common area lake access point not just to me, but to the county, designating it as a small craft public launch site. This was the ultimate victory. My access was now protected by the full weight of county law, making it impossible for any future HOA board to ever fence it off or restrict it again. The irony was sweet. Priscilla, in her greed, had tried to steal a public right-of-way for herself, and in the end, her actions resulted in that right-of-way being permanently secured for the actual public. I finally towed my boat back down the ramp, which was now paved and maintained by the county. I didn't gloat. I just launched my boat, the sound of the engine a quiet thunder on the now free waters of Lake Serenity. And as I looked back at the gray concrete wall shielding the unhappy, devalued homes of Lakeview Estates, I realized the moral of the story was simple. Mess with a man's water rights, and you invite a tidal wave of devastation. This story of vindictive justice and financial ruin is over, but the war against the entitled HOA president is never ending. What was the most shocking moment for you? Was it the devastating $3 million wall or the mandatory public apology? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more, hit that notification bell so you never miss a minute of the drama, and I'll see you in the next epic showdown.